What happens when the worldview upon which our modern civilization is built quietly and silently begins to crumble? What if matter is no longer the foundation of reality, but merely its visible result? And what if consciousness can no longer be regarded as a byproduct of the brain, but as something more fundamental? For centuries, science has relied on a clear assumption. Matter is primary. Everything else arises from it. Thoughts, feelings, perceptions, mere processes in the brain, explainable through chemistry and physics. Yet this very image is increasingly faltering. More and more questions remain unanswered. Consciousness eludes all measurement. Subjective experience fits into no model. And even physics is beginning to show that reality has no fixed state without observation. Perhaps we are not experiencing a mistake, but a transition. A moment in which an old worldview is no longer sufficient to explain what we are experiencing. A moment in which matter loses its role as the origin, and consciousness begins to be recognized as that which could precede everything else. This video is not a provocation. It is an invitation to think further. Modern science is based on a seemingly simple assumption. Matter is the origin of everything. Everything that exists, stars, bodies, thoughts, feelings, consciousness, is regarded in this worldview as the result of physical processes. Particles move, atoms bond, molecules react, nerve cells fire, and somewhere in this chain consciousness is supposed to emerge as a product, as a side effect, as a function of the brain. This way of thinking is called materialism. It is no coincidence that this worldview has become so dominant. Materialism has produced enormous successes. It has enabled technologies, made diseases treatable, and created machines that have changed our world. By focusing on the measurable, visible, and reproducible, science has been able to develop precise models and apply them practically. Yet here lies its central assumption. Only what is measurable is considered real. Consciousness never really fit into this schema. Therefore, it was redefined. Instead of viewing consciousness as something independent, it was explained as a product of neural activity. Thoughts were regarded as chemical reactions, feelings as biochemical states, perception as electrical signals, which I was told were illusions generated by the brain. This perspective was not only convenient, it was necessary. For a scientific system based on measurability cannot cope with something that cannot be objectively measured. So consciousness was reduced, not because it was fully understood, but because otherwise there would have been no functioning model. For decades, this model worked remarkably well. Brain scans showed patterns of activity. Medications influenced moods. Injuries altered personalities. All of this seemed to confirm that consciousness arises in the brain. When the brain changes, so does experience. Yet these successes concealed a crucial weakness. Correlation is not explanation. That certain brain areas are active when we feel or think does not explain why anything is experienced at all. It does not explain why electrical signals produce subjective experience. It does not explain why it feels like something to exist. The so-called hard problem of consciousness remained. One could describe more and more precisely what happens in the brain, but not why experience arises from it. Why is there an inner experience at all? Why is there someone who perceives? Materialism had no answer to this, so one sidestepped the issue. Consciousness was declared to be fully explainable, just not yet explained. And one assumed that with enough data, computational power, and models, the problem would eventually disappear. Yet, that is precisely what did not happen. Instead, anomalies began to accumulate. The deeper one delved, the clearer it became. Consciousness cannot be localized. There is no single center in the brain, no clear place where experience arises. Consciousness is not additive. It does not break down into parts. It does not simply vanish when analyzed. It eludes analysis. And here begins the rift in the materialistic worldview. For the foundation of this worldview states, Everything real can be objectively described. Consciousness contradicts this. It is real, yet not objectively accessible. It is universal, yet not measurable. It is fundamental to every experience, yet itself is not an object. Without consciousness, there would be no science, no measurement, no observation, no theory. Materialism presupposes consciousness in order to explain it, and in doing so, it bites its own tail. Moreover, there is another problem. Materialism explains the world, but not meaning. It can describe how processes unfold, but not why existence means anything at all, why something is experienced, why values arise, why meaning matters. All these questions were dismissed as unscientific. Yet they did not disappear, they were merely repressed. And it is this repression that today reveals its limits. For a world that consists solely of matter may explain machines, but not humans. It explains functions, but not experience. It explains processes, but not consciousness. Materialism was successful because it served as a tool, but it was mistakenly elevated to a worldview. A model was confused with reality, and now, as more and more phenomena no longer fit within it, this model begins to crumble, not abruptly, not spectacularly, but quietly. Through doubt, through open questions, through researchers who are honest enough to say, we do not know what consciousness truly is. This does not mean that materialism was wrong. It was useful, it was necessary, it was a step, but not an end point. And here we stand now at the edge of a worldview that is no longer sufficient, and at the beginning of a question that is greater than matter. What if consciousness does not arise from the world, but rather the world arises within consciousness? This question is uncomfortable, but it is unavoidable, and it marks the beginning of a new way of thinking. The more successful science became, the more its limits became apparent, especially where it attempted to explain consciousness entirely within the framework of the materialistic worldview. For it is precisely here that questions have accumulated, for which there are still no satisfactory answers. The first major problem is measurability. Consciousness is omnipresent, yet not measurable. One can measure brain activities, record electrical impulses, analyze metabolic processes. Yet all this data captures only the accompanying phenomena of experience, not the experience itself. No measuring device reveals pain, joy, fear, or meaning. It merely shows neuronal correlations. And here lies the crucial point. A correlation explains nothing about the cause of why certain brain areas are active when a person experiences something. It does not say why this experience exists. It does not explain why subjective experience arises from physical processes, why it feels like something to see, to think, or to feel, or this problem cannot be solved through better technology, for even perfect data would only describe what happens in the brain, not why it is experienced. The second problem is localization. In and land, despite decades of research, there is no clear location in the brain where consciousness resides. There is no single structure, no center, no switch. Consciousness does not seem to be either local or additive. It cannot be broken down into parts without disappearing in the process. One can remove, damage, or stimulate brain regions. Yet consciousness does not simply vanish. It changes, fragments, shifts, but it remains present. This contradicts the assumption that consciousness is a clearly locatable product of material processes. The third problem is reducibility. Materialism assumes that complex phenomena can be reduced to simpler components. Chemistry to physics, biology to chemistry, psychology to neurobiology, consciousness to brain processes. Yet this final step fails, for consciousness is not composed of parts that can be examined individually. It is not an object among objects. It is not a thing. It is the condition for things to even appear. Subjective experience cannot be explained by its components because it has no components in the classical sense. It is indivisible, holistic, always already there. The fourth problem is subjectivity. Science is based on objectivity, on observations that can be reproduced independently of the observer. Consciousness, however, is fundamentally subjective. It exists only from the first-person perspective. One can never directly observe the experience of another person. One can only infer, describe, interpret, yet it cannot be measured like a length or a weight. This does not mean that consciousness is less real. On the contrary, everything that has ever been measured, thought, or explored appeared within consciousness. Consciousness is not an object of the world. It is the field in which the world becomes experienceable at all. Materialism, however, tries to treat consciousness as an object and fails precisely at that. The fifth problem is meaning. Matter knows no meaning. Particles have no values. Processes have no goals. Yet human experience is permeated by sense, meaning, intention, and value. Why does something feel important? Why does something mean more than something else? Why do we feel responsibility, guilt, hope, or purpose? All these phenomena cannot be derived from blind matter. One can describe their neural correlates, but cannot explain why they have meaning. Materialism can describe how decisions are made, but not why they feel meaningful. The sixth problem is epistemology. If consciousness is merely a byproduct of blind material processes, then an uncomfortable question arises. Why should our thoughts be capable of truth? If thinking is only the result of evolutionary adaptation, optimized for survival and not for truth, then there is no reason to assume that our beliefs accurately reflect reality. Materialism thus undermines the foundation of its own knowledge. It explains the mind in such a way that it can no longer trust itself. The seventh problem is the honesty of research. More and more scientists openly admit that consciousness is one of the greatest unsolved problems, not as a peripheral issue, but as a central foundation. There is no widely accepted model, no theory that explains how experience arises from matter, no formula that derives subjective experience, no consensus on what consciousness even is. This honesty is new and significant, for it shows that the problem does not lie in a lack of technology. It lies in the worldview within which these questions are posed. Materialism does not encounter a technical limit here, but a conceptual one. Nanfsanen, he cannot explain consciousness without questioning his own fundamental assumptions, and that is precisely what is beginning to happen now. Not loudly, not revolutionarily, but gradually in scholarly articles and conferences, in open questions, in cautious redefinitions. The decay of the materialistic worldview does not begin with a bang. It begins with the admission that something crucial is missing, and this something cannot be measured, localized, or reduced, because it may not exist in the world, but rather emerges within it. This realization does not mark a collapse of science. It marks its next boundary and perhaps its next step. For a long time, physics was considered the last bastion of the materialistic worldview. Even if consciousness was difficult to explain, at least physical reality seemed solid, objective, and independent of the observer. Particles moved according to clear laws. Causes led to effects. Space and time formed a stable stage upon which everything unfolded, yet it was precisely this foundation that began to crumble in the 20th century. Not through philosophy, not through spirituality, but through physics itself. With the development of quantum physics, science encountered phenomena that could no longer be integrated into the classical worldview. At a fundamental level, reality suddenly behaved differently than materialism allowed. One of the first problems was the role of the observer. In classical physics, the observer plays no role. An object possesses properties regardless of whether someone measures it or not. A stone exists whether you look at it or not. Its mass, its position, its velocity are objective facts. In quantum physics, this is no longer the case. At the level of elementary particles, properties do not exist definitively until they are measured. Particles exist in states of superposition. They are not here or there, but potentially in multiple places at once. Only through a measurement does the system assume a specific state. This is not a philosophical thought experiment. It has been experimentally confirmed. The crucial question is, what exactly causes this transition from possibility to reality? Physics can describe it mathematically, but it cannot explain it. This is referred to as the collapse of the wave function. Yet this term names the phenomenon without understanding it. For why a measurement acts as an observation that establishes reality remains unresolved. Here arises a problem that materialism cannot solve. Observation does not seem to be passive. It is not neutral. It is effective. Thus, reality becomes intertwined with the act of observing. The second major problem concerns space and time. In the classical worldview, space and time are the fundamental conditions of existence. Everything exists somewhere. Everything happens at a specific moment. Space and time are fundamental. Yet modern physics calls this into question. In the theory of relativity, space and time lose their absolute significance. They are not fixed, but dependent on the observer. Time passes at different rates. Space curves. Cause and effect are no longer distinctly separated. In quantum physics, researchers go even further. An increasing number of theories suggest that space and time themselves are not fundamental quantities, but arise from deeper structures, from relations, from information, from processes that are not spatial or temporal in the classical sense. This means that the stage upon which matter exists may itself not be a fundamental component of reality. And if space and time are not fundamental, then matter cannot be either, for matter always exists within space and time. Thus, the materialistic worldview loses its solid ground. The third problem concerns classical causality. Materialism is based on a clear principle of cause and effect. Every effect has a cause. Processes unfold linearly. The past determines the future. In the quantum realm, this principle operates only to a limited extent. There are processes that cannot be explained in a straightforward causal manner. Events occur probabilistically. Outcomes can only be predicted statistically. Individual events lack a clear cause in the classical sense. This is not a sign of ignorance. It is a characteristic of reality itself as it is experimentally observed. Consequently, yet another pillar of materialistic thought begins to wobble: the notion that reality is entirely deterministic. If the fundamental level of reality does not function strictly causally, then matter is not the closed mechanical system it was long believed to be. The fourth problem is mathematics itself. Physics does not describe reality directly. It describes it through mathematical structures, and these structures often prove to be more fundamental than the things they describe. In many modern theories, mathematics seems not only to be a tool, but something that underlies reality itself. Relationships, symmetries, informational structures, not particles, form the foundation of the models. This raises a deeper question. Why is the world mathematically describable? Why does reality correspond to abstract structures that exist independently of matter? Why do form, information, and relationship seem to be more fundamental than material substance? Materialism has no answer to this, for mathematics is not material. The fifth problem is the separation of mind and world. Classical physics assumed that the mind describes the world but is not part of its structure. The observer stands outside the reality they investigate. Modern physics can no longer maintain this separation. Observer, measurement, and system form an inseparable unity. Reality is not simply out there. It emerges in the interplay of structure and observation. This does not mean that humans create the world, but it does mean that reality cannot be fully described without reference to consciousness. Thus, physics approaches a boundary where it must question its own fundamental assumptions, not because it has failed, but because it has been successful enough to look deeply. The cracks in the foundation of physics are not signs of chaos. They are clues, indications that the materialistic worldview is too narrow to grasp the depth of reality, that matter is not the final building block, and that observation, information, and perhaps even consciousness play a more fundamental role than long assumed. Today, physics stands at a point where it must either limit its questions or expand its worldview, and it is precisely at this boundary that something new begins to take shape. Not as a finished theory, not as dogma, but as an open possibility that the foundation of reality consists not of things, but of relationships, information, and consciousness. This possibility is uncomfortable, yet it can no longer be ignored physically, and it lays the groundwork for a new paradigm. When a worldview collapses, initially there is a void. Old explanations no longer hold, and new ones have yet to be fully articulated. It is precisely in this in-between space that modern science finds itself today. Materialism is losing its explanatory power, yet in its place does not arise chaos but a cautious rethinking. And more researchers are beginning to seriously examine an idea that has long been considered unscientific, that consciousness does not arise from matter, but is more fundamental than matter itself. This new paradigm does not claim that matter is unimportant. Rather, it questions whether matter is truly the origin or merely a manifestation. The crucial difference lies in the order of things. In the materialistic worldview, it is matter, brain, consciousness. In the new paradigm, this order is reversed, or at least thought of more openly: consciousness, information, matter. This shift may seem subtle, yet its consequences are profound. The first hint of this new thinking comes from consciousness research itself. The more precisely one examines the brain, the less it appears to be a producer of consciousness. Instead, it increasingly resembles a mediator, a filter, or an interface. Changes in the brain alter experience. Yes, but change is not the same as creation. A radio does not produce music. It receives, modulates, and translates signals. If the device is damaged, the sound becomes distorted, yet no one would conclude that the music originates in the radio. This model of comparison is being discussed again today, not as a metaphor, but as a serious hypothesis. Perhaps the brain is not a generator of consciousness, but an organ. Consciousness structures, limits, and focuses. The second hint comes from physics and information theory. More and more theories describe matter not as a solid substance, but as a result of deeper informational structures. Particles become mathematical relationships, fields become probabilities. Reality becomes a network of information. Yet information does not exist in a vacuum. Information always presupposes meaning, and meaning presupposes consciousness. Information without someone for whom it is information is physically meaningless. Thus, consciousness moves not to the periphery of theory, but to the center. The third hint comes from the philosophy of mind, which increasingly acknowledges that consciousness cannot be explained as an emergent byproduct. Emergence describes how new properties arise from complex systems. Yet self-emergent properties presuppose a substrate that carries them. The problem is, consciousness does not merely carry properties, it carries experience itself. It is not a property of matter like temperature or motion. It is the field in which properties appear. Therefore, more and more thinkers propose to consider consciousness as fundamental, comparable to space, time, or energy, or even more fundamental than these. This way of thinking does not represent a regression to pre-scientific worldviews. On the contrary, it is an attempt to scientifically engage with what has so far been excluded. The fourth hint comes from boundary research and interdisciplinary studies. Phenomena such as altered states of consciousness, near-death experiences, deep meditative states, or unusual perceptions are difficult to fully reduce to brain activity. Not because they must be mysterious, but because they show that consciousness is not strictly bound to normal neuronal activity patterns. These observations do not force a specific interpretation, but they open the space for new questions. What if consciousness is not local? What if it is not confined to the brain? What if individual consciousnesses are expressions of a broader field? The fifth hint lies in the self-referential nature of knowledge. Every theory, every measurement, every equation arises in consciousness. Science is not a process outside the mind. It is an activity of consciousness attempting to understand itself and the world. A worldview that dismisses consciousness as merely a byproduct thus explains away its own origin. It saws at the branch upon which it sits. None. The new paradigm takes this circumstance seriously. It does not attempt to explain away consciousness, but rather accepts it as a starting point. This does not mean that everything is consciousness or that matter is an illusion. It means that matter may be a manifestation of something deeper, just as an image on a screen is an expression of code without being the code itself. This way of thinking alters the direction of the questions we ask. Instead of asking how matter produces consciousness, we ask how consciousness structures matter. Instead of inquiring how experience arises from particles, we ask why particles appear within experience. These questions are radical, yet they are not irrational. They emerge where old models fail. The new paradigm is not a finished system. It is not a dogma. It is a movement, an opening, an attempt to think about reality more comprehensively. It acknowledges the successes of materialism without remaining confined to its limits. It integrates physics, consciousness research, and philosophy without conflating them. And it allows us to speak about reality without excluding consciousness from it. Perhaps matter is not the foundation of reality. Perhaps it is a language through which something deeper expresses itself. Perhaps consciousness is not something we possess, but rather something in which we exist. This paradigm does not force an answer, but it compels a new openness, and therein lies its significance. The collapse of a worldview is never merely a theoretical event. It does not remain confined to laboratories, universities, or scholarly publications. It resonates inwardly into our self-understanding, our values, the way we interpret ourselves and our lives. When the materialistic worldview loses its interpretive authority, not only science changes, but humanity does as well. For this worldview has shaped us for centuries. It has determined how we think about ourselves, who we are, what we believe we are, and what we consider possible. In materialistic thinking, a human being is primarily a biological organism, a complex system of cells, chemistry, and electrical impulses. Consciousness is a byproduct, meaning a construction, purpose a subjective attribution. This image has consequences. It shapes our medicine, our psychology, our economy, our education systems. It influences how we deal with illness, with suffering, with death. It forms a society that prioritizes function over meaning, efficiency over depth, and performance over being. When this worldview collapses, the coordinate system begins to shift. The first thing that changes is our self-image. When consciousness is no longer understood merely as a product of material processes, we are not just bodies with thoughts. We cannot be reduced to our biology. What we call I is then not merely a neural construct. This does not mean that the body becomes unimportant, but it is no longer everything. The human being becomes more than function, more than role, more than object. They become a conscious being whose experience is not fully explainable from the outside. This shift is subtle yet profound. It changes how we speak about dignity, about responsibility, about freedom. For if consciousness is fundamental, then human experience is not interchangeable, not arbitrary, not purely mechanical. The second thing that changes is our relationship to meaning. In the materialistic worldview, meaning is not a component of reality. It is generated, not discovered. The universe is indifferent. The meaning arises only in the human mind. And if consciousness is, however, more fundamental than matter, then meaning is not merely a psychological construct. It may be a property of reality itself, something that is not invented but experienced. This changes the way we ask questions. No longer just, how does something work, but also, what does it mean? Not as a replacement for science, but as a complement. The third thing that changes is our relationship with death. In the materialistic worldview, death is the end of all experience. Consciousness extinguishes, and all that remains is matter. This notion profoundly shapes, often unconsciously, our fears, our priorities, and our life choices. However, if consciousness is not entirely bound to material processes, then death loses its absolute character. It does not automatically become the end of experience, but rather a boundary about which we know less than we thought. This does not mean that there are clear answers, but it does mean that the question remains open, and openness transforms the inner space in which people live. The fourth change is our conception of identity. In the old worldview, identity is closely tied to biography, body, and history. We are what we have experienced, what we have learned, what our brains have stored. In the new thinking, identity becomes more fluid, deeper, less fixed on roles and concepts. The self is not abolished but relativized. Identity becomes something that unfolds in consciousness, not merely anchored in matter. This can be unsettling, for fixed identities provide stability, yet it can also be liberating, as rigid self-images create suffering. The disintegration of the old worldview compels us to ask anew, who am I beyond my function, beyond my achievements, beyond my role? The fifth change is our society. A materialistic worldview favors systems that regard people as resources, as labor forces, as consumers, as numbers in statistics. It promotes optimization, but often at the expense of depth, relationship, and inner meaning. When consciousness is recognized as fundamental, priorities shift, not immediately, not automatically, but in the long term. Health becomes more than mere repair, education more than the transmission of knowledge, and the economy more than growth at any cost. Not because morality demands it, but because the image of humanity is changing. The sixth aspect is the inner conflict that many feel today. The disintegration of the materialistic worldview does not happen cleanly and orderly. It occurs amidst life. People sense that old explanations no longer hold, without yet having new ones. This creates uncertainty, crises of meaning, disorientation, the feeling of standing between worlds. This feeling is not a personal failure. It is a sign of transition. A worldview does not die loudly. It dies quietly in the questions of people, and therein lies the significance of this moment. The disintegration of the old worldview is not a catastrophe. It is an invitation to think of reality not more narrowly but more expansively, to take humanity not less seriously but more so, to not dismiss consciousness but to explore it. This transformation is unstoppable, not because someone desires it, but because the questions have grown larger than the answers. And like every profound change, it does not begin externally but internally, in the willingness to let go of old certainties and to embrace new questions even before clear answers emerge. The materialistic worldview does not crumble because it has deceived us. It crumbles because it can no longer explain everything. It was a necessary step. It created order, enabled progress, and structured knowledge. In any and yet every map is only as useful as it corresponds to the terrain. Today we stand at a point where the old boundaries become visible. Consciousness can no longer be pushed to the margins. Experience can no longer be diminished. Significance can no longer be excluded. What is disintegrating is not an error, but a simplification. And what is emerging is not a finished, new worldview, but an openness to deeper questions. Perhaps it is not about rejecting matter, but about placing it within a larger context, one in which consciousness does not need to be explained, but is understood as a starting point. The crucial question is not whether this worldview is changing, but how willing we are to think along as old certainties fade and new questions arise. For every era recognizes itself by the questions it can no longer avoid. Spirit to spirit, your zeitgeist.